Chief Justice John Roberts had never lost his temper like that, until the day he faced a young congresswoman he never expected would make him lose control on live national television. At an event held at the National Constitution Center, a venue that had once hosted historic speeches by U.S. presidents and top justices, the dialogue between generations was expected to be no more than an annual political media program. No one imagined that in such a solemn setting, the most powerful man in the judicial branch would slam his hand on the table and yell at a young congresswoman right in front of the cameras. He thought that by launching a personal attack, he would make Jasmine Crockett back down. He thought that by raising his voice, he would regain control. But what he didn't expect was that Jasmine wouldn't respond with anger. No argument, no outrage. She simply looked at him, then calmly said one sentence. A line that would soon be quoted across the United States. In that moment, the entire room went silent. Not because power had spoken, but because composure had made everyone stop and listen. Just hours later, the video spread like wildfire. Scholars, students, everyday people, even those who once doubted her, began mentioning Jasmine Crockett as a symbol of intellectual strength that doesn't need to shout. And the story you're about to see isn't just about a debate. It's about a generational shift in less than 30 seconds. What state or city are you from? Leave a comment below, and if you believe that calm can change the world, hit subscribe now. The story begins. The dialogue, titled "The Supreme Court and Democracy," was held at the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia, a site deeply symbolic in American political life. It was more than just a hall. It was a place that had witnessed meetings between top lawmakers and hosted speeches that marked ideological turning points for generations of political leaders. The media often referred to it as the heart of constitutional democracy. This year's event was broadcast live on 4 major networks: MSNBC, PBS, C-SPAN, and Fox. Hundreds of law students, scholars, researchers, and former judges attended. On the surface, the topic seemed purely academic: the Supreme Court and democratic accountability in the 21st century. But everyone understood. 2025 was a year of constitutional controversy, polarizing rulings, and a simmering clash between old and new generations. And at the center of the stage stood a man no one dared ignore. Chief Justice John Roberts, the nation's top jurist who had led the federal judiciary for nearly 2 decades. Dressed in a dark suit, a pale blue tie, and wearing an expression sharp as a scalpel, he appeared before the audience with the icy confidence of someone who not only held power, but believed he was the only one who truly understood the law. Roberts had long been praised as the embodiment of traditional judicial character, composed, intellectual, and a guardian of institutional order. But beneath that exterior was something widely understood, yet rarely voiced. He did not like to be challenged. In public confrontations, he would often deflect, sidestep, or assume a patronizing tone. It was the kind of power wielded by someone accustomed to being above every argument. Across the stage sat someone who initially drew little attention. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett from Texas was introduced as a new voice in congressional legal discourse. Young, black, with a distinctly Southern manner, she sat quietly at the end of the table, neither vying for the mic nor speaking early. On social media, her name had begun to circulate recently due to her sharp legal arguments during House hearings. But on a stage like this, surrounded by distinguished professors and textbook authors, she was merely a guest with low expectations. In the early moments, the spotlight was entirely on Roberts. He opened the dialogue, given the privilege of the first 15 minutes to speak on judicial independence and the importance of neutrality in the application of law. Weighty academic references, statistics, and historical comparisons accompanied every sentence he delivered, followed him continuously. The audience nodded along. His words moved like commands, cold, clear, authoritative. When it came time for Jasmine to speak, the microphone was passed to her as a formality. The organizers allotted her 6 minutes, No one expected anything groundbreaking. She simply thanked the panel, opened her notes, and began in a soft but steady voice. "We talk about neutrality," she began. "So I want to bring back a 2014 ruling in which the Supreme Court issued a decision that stripped over 40,000 black citizens of their right to respond in court." The atmosphere shifted. Jasmine didn't speak in vague terms. She quoted directly from the case files, named the justices involved, and, most notably, stated clearly that Chief Justice John Roberts had authored the majority opinion. For the first time in the program, Roberts' eyes left the audience and turned to her. It wasn't a friendly gaze, nor was it indifferent. It was a visibly guarded stare. The room remained orderly, but the air had changed. Some students began looking down at their phones, searching for the 2014 ruling. Reporters in the back rows started typing faster. The cameras slowly began to pan toward Jasmine as well. Roberts did not interrupt her, but everyone could feel he was being pulled out of his comfort zone. Jasmine ended her brief statement with a line that didn't sound confrontational, but was enough to elevate the tension in the room. "Perhaps if we want to talk about democracy and the judiciary today, we must first confront the very decisions where the judiciary has wounded democracy." No one applauded. No one laughed. But the eyes in the room were no longer the same. The room remained unnervingly still, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for something to break away from the original script. Every microphone picked up the soft rustle of pages, every quiet exhale, and every camera had begun to shift toward a figure whom, just 15 minutes earlier, few had expected would transform the atmosphere. Jasmine Crockett looked up, but she didn't meet Chief Justice John Roberts' eyes. Instead, she looked down at her folder, as if everything she needed to say had already been laid out, cold, precise, inevitable. "The 2014 decision in Crawford v. Shelby County," she said, pronouncing each word clearly, "has been regarded as a regression in civil rights, especially for communities of color." In it, the Chief Justice wrote, and I quote, "The court is under no obligation to protect a minority group solely because history once favored them." A few murmurs rose. Not many. Just a few sharp breaths, a couple of furrowed brows, but enough to trigger a ripple effect. People in the back began leaning forward, trying to get a clearer view of the document in her hand. Roberts shifted slightly. His hand rested on the table, no longer in the relaxed pose from earlier. His arm had stiffened, and his fingers began to tap rhythmically, a subconscious habit when feeling cornered. "That quote is taken out of context," he said, cutting in without waiting. His voice was dry and clipped, but not yet unhinged. "It's part of a counter-argument section. It doesn't reflect the court's core reasoning." Jasmine paused. She didn't turn her head. She didn't respond. She simply reached to the side, pulled out another document, a handwritten draft from the Chief Justice himself, archived during the opinion's preparation. Slowly, she raised it. "This is the original manuscript, archived at the Supreme Court Record Center, file ID JR/2014/A3. With permission, I'd like to read a handwritten note by the Chief Justice." One beat of silence. Then she read, "If the majority feels discomfort at allegations of bias, perhaps we should refrain from issuing rulings that might offend them, even if legally justified." A camera shutter clicked. A reporter down front sat upright. A law student covered her mouth with her hand. Roberts didn't reply, but his eyes locked on Jasmine, not with the gaze of a seasoned mentor but of a man suddenly placed under the scrutiny of moral judgment. "You're deliberately distorting," he said again. This time less composed. His voice echoed through the mic, bouncing to the lower rows. Jasmine didn't look back. She didn't argue. She turned the page. The Chief Justice also added, I quote, "Once law is forced to apologize, judicial autonomy soon becomes enslaved to political sentiment." A chill swept the auditorium, not from the air conditioning, but from the sheer tension of the silence. A cold weight had begun spreading across the polished wooden benches and bright stage lights. Roberts pushed his chair back, leaned toward his mic. No request, no waiting for his turn. "How old are you?" The question dropped like a trap. Jasmine lifted her eyes slowly. 43, sir." "I was drafting legislation before you'd even started grade school," he said with a cold smile. "And I don't need anyone explaining to me what I wrote, especially someone who uses drafts to attack the Supreme Court." His words landed like a strike from above, meant not just to discredit her point, but to remind her where she stood in the power hierarchy. A few scattered claps rang out, soft, isolated, from a far corner of the room. They stopped quickly, fading as no one joined in. Jasmine said nothing. She didn't clap back. She didn't clarify. She simply raised her eyes, placed a hand on her papers, and looked straight ahead. Her voice, when it came, was quiet, so much so that the room leaned in to hear, "I don't think you need to explain what you wrote, sir. I just believe, if you stand by it, then others reading it shouldn't offend you." The mic gave a faint crackle, but no technician moved. Roberts frowned. His brow dropped, then shot back up. "You're here to smear. You're not here to discuss. You're here to launch a personal attack." His voice brimmed with anger, punctuated by a loud bang of his hand on the table. It was the loudest sound since the event began. Those in the front rows flinched. Students in the back stopped typing. A law professor bowed his head, unclear whether out of shame or to note something significant. Jasmine remained still. Her lips didn't purse. Her hands didn't shake. She simply opened another page, this time the officially published ruling, bearing the Library of the Congress seal. "I will now cite from the public record, this ruling does not take into account the historical factor of race, as the court does not view it as a legally material element." That's the published text, not a draft. Roberts couldn't hold back anymore. He shot to his feet. His chair slammed into the wooden paneling. The mic swung, cables snapping out of place. "I will not let someone like you smear this institution." The scream echoed. Truly screamed. No more composure. No more sentence structure. Just the raw sound of someone once seen as the embodiment of control, now exposed to the public, red-eyed, trembling, voice breaking. The auditorium fell dead silent. No shuffling, no coughing, no movement. The cameras zoomed in. The lenses tightened. The large screen behind the stage displayed Jasmine Crockett's face. She hadn't moved. She didn't shift. Her chin lifted slightly. The stage lights caught the curve of her lashes and the line of her nose, casting a sharp silhouette of resolve in the center of an invisible storm. And then, a moment no one would forget, she gave a small nod. Not in agreement, not in mockery, but in acknowledgement. Acknowledgement that the outburst didn't surprise her. Acknowledgement that when the truth is repeated at the right moment, power no longer needs to shout to be heard. After Robert's outburst, the entire room seemed frozen in place. No coughs, no chairs shifting. No one is speaking up to intervene. Everything stopped, as if time had been suspended at a single point. The image of a powerful man losing control, face to face with a woman seated firmly, hands on a folder, neither trembling nor backing down. Jasmine Crockett didn't move. She stared straight ahead, not at Roberts, not at the audience, not at the cameras. Her gaze cut through the heat of the stage lights, piercing into that silent space between speaker and listener. And then she spoke, not loudly, not with anger. Her words came out like a breath, but they cut like a blade through pretense. "If the words I read made you angry, then maybe you're hearing yourself for the first time." A long pause followed. The sentence needed no elaboration, no sharp tone. It simply stood there, raw and unyielding. A truth exposed, undeniable and unalterable. Some glanced at each other. A few eyes turned back to Roberts as if expecting a response, but he said nothing. He stood still, clutching the microphone, lips frozen. The fury from earlier had vanished, leaving behind an eerie void on his face. Not quite shame, not quite regret. Just total silence. In the third row, a young law student from Howard University, brown-skinned, hair in a high bun, quietly raised her hand. No one had asked her to. But the gesture, as soft as a breeze, shifted the room's energy. She rose to her feet. Her voice trembled but remained clear. "I just want to ask one thing. If justice is supposed to be fair, why is it so easily hurt?" No applause, no chuckles. No one whispered, "Good question." Her words didn't sound like a challenge, but like a sting. A sting born of truth. And perhaps it hit so deeply because it wasn't aimed at anyone in particular, yet everyone felt it. Jasmine looked at the student. She didn't answer right away. She simply gave a soft nod, as if to say that question deserved to remain. The air in the room began to shift, not through words, but through glances. The camera panned slowly across the audience. A white student in the front row clutching her pen so tightly her fingers had gone pale. A silver-haired professor from Yale, sighing, chin resting in his hand. A seasoned legal reporter setting his recorder down, no longer recording. Every gaze now reflected quiet astonishment. No one mentioned the 2014 ruling anymore. No one asked about the quote or the original files. Because everyone had seen, the moment's power didn't lie in the documents. It lay in how someone responded when forced to hear their own words aloud. Jasmine didn't need to say more. And Roberts, he couldn't. He stood there silent, but not in control. It was the silence of someone stripped of power without anyone laying a finger on him. No one interrupted. No one shouted. But everything had slipped from his grasp the moment he screamed. The air no longer carried confrontation. It had become listening. A kind of listening. Not reserved for the person with the microphone, but for the moment itself. No one announced a pause in the program. But everyone knew. This was the point of no return. A seasoned attorney leaned over to the person next to him and whispered, "This is the first time I've seen power defeated, without a single accusation." A young law lecturer live-streaming the event on TikTok typed a caption, "She didn't win with arguments. She made him hear himself." At the back left corner of the stage, the CNN camera light remained on, but the lens no longer followed Roberts. It pointed at Jasmine, and the silent audience behind her. Those who said nothing, but had shifted their gaze. Every second afterward remained quiet. But it was no longer the tense, rigid silence from before. It was a silence with weight. The weight of what had just been laid bare. No one had to say it, but everyone in the room understood. That confrontation wasn't about who won or lost. It was about who was still standing after their truth had been spoken too clearly to ignore. The room remained still, like a frozen lake after a wave has passed. No one sat upright out of formality anymore. No one looked toward the man of power on stage for guidance. The name, Chief Justice John Roberts, no longer stood as the embodiment of the Supreme Court's authority, but as a symbol of something just struck at the core. When power is forced to hear itself, sometimes it simply can't bear the sound. In that silence, a voice rose from the fifth row. Young, clear, unhurried. Chief Justice, a young reporter from The Atlantic, stood, notebook in hand. "If I may, I'd like to recall something you said in 1991, when you were still legal advisor to the Attorney General. A good leader is someone who knows how to remain silent in the face of hard questions, not out of fear, but because truth often needs silence to be heard." All heads turned. The quote wasn't confrontational. It didn't accuse, but it was a mirror, laced squarely before a man who had just screamed. Roberts didn't reply. His eyes blinked once. His hands rested motionless on the desk, and that was the moment Jasmine Crockett chose not to speak. She didn't press the mistake. She didn't use the silence to declare victory. She simply leaned down and retrieved a small slip of paper from her folder. Pale yellow, edges lightly creased. No microphone, no statement. She held it up toward the main broadcast camera. In the control room, the technician cut to a close-up, and viewers across the country saw a handwritten scan with a clear title, Shelby County Decision Draft, Internal Copy, J. Roberts, 2014. No need to read it aloud, no need to explain. Beneath the title, in a slightly right-slanted script, written by the Chief Justice himself, I recognize this ruling may hurt many. But if we prioritize emotion over constitutionality, we risk losing the necessary coldness of the law. A few exhaled. Some lowered their heads. Others suddenly realized that the entire chessboard had been set long ago. Jasmine hadn't forced anything. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't accuse. She simply offered evidence at the precise moment when words were no longer needed. And when truth appears like that, there is no doubt left. She wasn't just debating. She had already read the whole script and waited to peel back each layer exactly when her opponent exposed his weakness. In the left corner of the hall, a political historian typed rapidly into his laptop. The moment a woman of color quoted the original handwriting of a Supreme Court decision, not with volume, but with documentation. A Stanford professor, one who had initially opposed Jasmine's invitation, whispered to a colleague, "She didn't come to speak. She came to help us listen to our history." Roberts stayed silent. He looked down at the table. No one asked him to respond, because he was no longer a part of the conversation. He now sat inside the silence he had created. On the giant screen behind the stage, the tech crew no longer displayed the Supreme Court composition chart. They showed the handwritten document. Clear, unblurred, logo intact. At the bottom, a caption appeared, verified by National Archives and Records Administration, 2015. And at that moment, throughout the auditorium, from conservative scholars, first-year law students to reporters racing against deadline, everyone understood they had just witnessed something irreversible. Not a debate, not a misstep, but the collapse of an old balance held together by reverence and silence. Jasmine Crockett didn't say another word. She didn't glance at the crowd. She didn't smile. She simply folded the scan, slid it into an envelope, and set it aside, as if closing a clerical task. There was no victory, only confirmation that someone had prepared down to the final page and didn't need to say more because her opponent would finish the collapse on his own. 3 hours after the forum ended, Jasmine Crockett's words had already spread across dozens of social media accounts. Quoted verbatim, repeated again and again, set to slow background music, white subtitles over a black screen. You don't need to shout when you're speaking the truth. No exclamation marks, no flashy fonts, no dramatic transitions, just a 6-second clip. Jasmine's steady gaze, her calm voice, and Chief Justice John Roberts' frozen face immediately after. By the next morning, the hashtag number #QuietJustice had appeared over 4.2 million times on Twitter X. Not as a passing trend, but as a collective affirmation that people had waited far too long to see a black woman seated lower in the hierarchy, not screaming, and still shaking the foundations of power. At Harvard Law School, a group of students posted her quote on the central bulletin board, surrounded by recruitment notices and seminar flyers. The bold, all-caps line read, "You don't need to shout when you're speaking the truth." Representative Jasmine Crockett. Beneath it, handwritten in ink, Class of 2026. The next morning, a professor of constitutional theory opened class with a silent 40-second clip. No slides, no introduction. The room sat still. Then he asked one question. So, who was actually in control of that dialogue? No one answered, and that became the launch point for the most intense analysis of rhetorical power in the course's history. The New York Times published an op-ed Monday morning, its headline clean and layered, "The Day Power Learned to Be Silent." The author didn't criticize Roberts, nor did they glorify Jasmine. The article simply traced the timeline, cited exact quotes, and ended with this quiet reflection. When people stop shouting for attention and are heard the loudest, that's when a society begins to change. At Yale, Stanford, Columbia, Northwestern, and even smaller law schools like Tulane and Howard, academic committees began discussing including Jasmine's video in next year's curriculum. Not because it was a political lesson, but because it was a living example of legal argumentation that wasn't defensive, wasn't aggressive, and didn't win by force, but by quiet, unshakable truth. At UCLA Law, a senior professor of legal rhetoric, who'd taught for nearly 30 years, announced that he would rewrite Chapter 4 of his course textbook. Previously titled Techniques of Rebuttal and Stage Control in Public Dialogue, it would now be renamed When Truth Doesn't Need to Yell, the Jasmine Crockett Case and the Art of Reclaiming Space with Silence. In legal circles, major shifts rarely come from revolutions. They arrive quietly as the High-tations begin to change. At a closed symposium of the Federal Law Academies Union during a panel on judicial responsibility in the age of public scrutiny, a scholar from Duke concluded, "What struck me wasn't the 2014 ruling. It was that no one in that system ever paused to ask, do they truly believe what they once wrote?" Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., the office of Chief Justice Roberts remained completely silent. No press release. No public clarification. No social media statement on any official channel. 2 weeks passed. Then, one Thursday afternoon, a quiet update appeared on the Supreme Court's internal website. A document was quietly removed from the public records, Roberts' 1991 speech, where he once stated, "A good leader knows how to remain silent in the face of hard questions." No announcement was made, but for those paying attention, that silent retraction said more than words ever could. Post-event analyses all returned to the same refrain. No one expected Roberts to lose control. No one expected Jasmine to remain silent afterward. And no one imagined that silence could reverse everything so swiftly. On student forums, Jasmine's clip was no longer labeled as a sharp rebuttal, but carried a new tag, the listening turn, the moment when silence became the act of power. Some graduating law students proposed adding the hashtag number listening turn to their theses, using it as the concluding symbol in papers on constitutional discourse and the moral resilience of public debate. No title was bestowed upon Jasmine, no award, no medal or statue erected, but her words, yet heard, had become a silent emblem, one that everyone understood, everyone repeated, and everyone used to re-examine themselves. ChatGPT Ja Noi, Mot Tuan Sao Dien Jan, Han Lang Sao Toa Na Kwok Hoi Noi Jasmine Crockett Lam Viek Ja Im Ang. There were no more cameras, no reporters waiting, and no more sideways glances, half mocking, half suspicious, like before. Everything moved more quietly. People still passed her, still greeted her, but something in their eyes had shifted. Not over-eager respect, not superficial admiration, but it is subtle, as if they needed a moment to listen more closely before continuing. Jasmine stepped into the back courtyard, where there were only a few stone benches and a short line of trees. She didn't carry a phone. No assistant walked beside her. In her hand was a white envelope, its edges worn from being folded over and over. Inside was the handwritten scan from John Roberts, the same one she had held up in the forum that day. She sat down on the bench. The sky was clear but not harsh. A light breeze drifted through. No one noticed, no one asked anything. And in that moment, with no cameras, no applause, she finally exhaled. Not because she had won, Not because she had silenced him, but because she had never needed to raise her voice. She had spoken the truth, and let the truth carry itself by its weight. Over 2,000 miles away, in a classroom in California, a young student was preparing for her justice and debate presentation. The topic, the power of language in post-event society. She chose just one example, a 46-second clip of Jasmine Crockett. Her first slide contained only one sentence. "You don't need to shout when you're speaking the truth." The final slide showed a still image, Jasmine's face at the 18th second, when she gave a subtle nod after Chief Justice John Roberts' outburst. No music, no animation, just that nod. And the student closed with a question for the class. When was the last time you nodded, not to agree, but to confirm a truth that couldn't be denied? In the days that followed, no one discussed the 2014 ruling anymore. No one dissected rebuttal techniques. No one debated who won. What lingered was the atmosphere, Jasmine's gaze, the silence she created, long enough, deep enough that an entire system built to command had to stop and hear itself. A journalist who had previously criticized Jasmine rewrote his op-ed. This time, he included the following. "Some victories don't make noise. But you know they happened when the one who screamed no longer dares to watch the tape." That moment didn't rewrite policy. No one was ousted, no one resigned. But it made thousands, students, professors, lawmakers, and even skeptics of dialogue, stop and ask a question that once felt too simple. Why are we so afraid of calm? Jasmine never brought up the incident again in interviews. When asked how she felt that day, she simply said, "I didn't need to feel anything. I just wanted them to hear their own words. That's all." Not a quote designed for headlines, but precisely for that reason, it endured. As for Chief Justice Roberts, he never reposted the speech. He didn't write a memoir. He didn't appear at the Supreme Court anniversary events as originally planned. Only one trace remained. The 1991 speech about staying silent in the face of difficult questions had disappeared from the court's official website. When history retells that day, they may use many labels. A confrontation of power and intellect, a generational passing of the torch, or simply, the moment one woman stayed silent, the system had no choice but to listen. However, it's remembered, one truth remains unshakable. Silence is not weakness. Calm is not surrender. And truth doesn't need to be shouted to be heard. And what about you? Have you ever been in a moment where someone shouted in your face, trying to overpower you, but you chose calm, and somehow, they lost control themselves? Or have you ever heard your own words played back and realized the truth stung more than any rebuttal? Share your story in the comments. I stayed silent. And then, and if you believe real strength isn't in the loudest voice, but in the one that doesn't need to yell to make the room pause, hit subscribe, because we're here to tell the stories they once thought no one would dare to tell.